Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today we're going to be kind of picking up with our study of the 1800s. Previously we were discussing a lot about Romanticism because that was a big movement, particularly in the first half of the 1800s, like 1800 to 1850. But later on, and kind of in parallel too, we also see realism. So it sort of starts a little bit around the same time, but then it continues on after that and really becomes more dominant in the second half of the 1800s, or what's known as the 19th century. The Romantics, what are the themes of Romanticism? There's nature, beauty, passion. There's also an interest in, we saw this with the painting of the slave ship, where slaves had been thrown overboard, and the horror and the disgust that that was happening. We do see in the work of the Romantics some interest in critiquing the dark side of the world as it's coming to be in the 1800s. Romantics are very interested in that, and that is a contrast with the Enlightenment philosophers, who were pretty keen to just say, "Oh, everything, we're optimistic, we can figure everything out." And the Romantics said, "Well, you've made some mistakes." But I would think the realists who we're going to talk about today would say even the Romantics are a little bit naive, because the Romantics are mostly talking about passion and beauty and things like that. And I think the realist would respond to that by saying, okay, well, what beauty, what, is passion going to help us solve these problems that exist in the world? And also, aren't you sort of obsessed, you romantics kind of obsessed with the grandeur and the emotional side of things? We want to get practical. We want to get down to brass tacks, and we want to look at what's actually there and take things, very genuinely and seriously. We want to be very clear-sighted, whereas the romantics might get more caught up in sort of the vision that they had in their head. We saw that with Napoleon, right? A lot of romantics got behind Napoleon, despite the fact that he might not have been objectively all that good. They just thought he sort of was symbolically powerful. Realists would probably be quicker to challenge that. Okay, but we're speaking in vague terms. Let's get a little more specific. The big sort of change that occurred in the 1800s, and you guys, you probably have some awareness of it in the background, is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution. If we're talking about things that made the modern world, I saw in the discussion questions, this was one of the biggest things that you guys identified, was the biggest changes between, 400 years ago and now, was the fact that we had all sorts of different technology that changed the way we worked, changed the way we lived. And the kickoff for that is really the Industrial Revolution. And then the Industrial Revolution, I think, arguably led to some good things. It also led to some horrific things. And in the 1900s, the consequences of that were much more apparent. So when we get to talking about realism, and realism's real interest in showing the horrors of the world so that we can have some sort of meaningful change, moving away from Enlightenment optimism to sort of shock and horror, and romantic optimism for that matter, into shock and horror. The big thing that the realists are responding to is the Industrial Revolution. So let's look into that a little bit more, and let's talk about that. So the Industrial Revolution, what was it? Well, you could think of it as basically when people started making lots of new technology. But to be more specific than that, the biggest shift that really sets it off is the steam engine. The fact that people started using steam power to power locomotives. And this is done usually with coal. You heat up the coal, it heats up some water, and the water steam turns turbines and things like that. That allows you to make machines that move, to make technology that moves faster than anybody had created before. And so, people often speculate about, like, why did the Industrial Revolution happen when and where it did? It happened originally in Britain, and then it spread to other parts of the West, to Europe and other countries that came to consider themselves in charge. And I think a big part of why it started in Britain is because Britain is just lousy with coal. So they were going to have an inherent advantage and be able to take advantage of that kind of technology. It's funny, throughout history, a lot of different cultures have come close to inventing the steam engine, but the applications of it aren't immediately obvious. Like, there isn't a label on it saying that's going to inevitably lead to the modern world, so people just don't see the potential usually, except that for whatever reason, it was different during this time period. period. Maybe that had to do with Enlightenment philosophy leading people to try and figure out new uses for technology and new ways of sort of reinventing society around that technology. It's kind of up for debate. There's a lot to think about there. I'd be curious what you guys think. But yeah, the steam engine kicks it all off. Locomotives, being able to transport goods from place to place really fast. It used to be that it was much faster to transport things over water than it was over land, just because boats can move a whole lot faster than like wagons. Well, now we have trains, and trains are going to change the game too. And in America, we see, for instance, the Transcontinental Railroad built, especially during the Civil War period in America, when they can basically do whatever they want in Washington. Um, and Yeah, and but also there's railroad building in Britain too. Today Europe is really well known for its railroads. I'd argue that America arguably dropped the ball on railroads compared to the European railway system, which can get you to lots of different countries really effectively. Eventually, this is going to lead to electricity. The electricity that we take for granted, powering our homes, giving us, everything that we value. It starts with the telegraph, which allows people to send messages really fast. They're short messages, but they can still do it using Morse code, named after the guy who invented the telegraph. Then you have the Transcontinental Railroad. And then by the late 1800s, the 1870s, you have the telephone invented. So it's not that long before people are just able to send their voices over wires, which is pretty mind-blowing. Today, we don't talk on the phone as much, but we have all our internet stuff. But that was a revelation every bit as relevant as the internet. And on top of that, I also want to mention modern clothing production. Up until a relatively modern day, clothing had to be sort of handmade, had to be made through really intensive processes out of like linen or cotton or things like that. Now there are factories where machines can make the process a whole lot faster. Of course, that's part of all this. This is changing everybody's lives. And as we see from the image, it's a little bit ominous, right? Like this looks sort of frightening and alarming. And we should be wary of the Industrial Revolution because it has a real dark side. It takes, previously through most of human history, almost everybody was a farmer. And what it does is it takes that role away. Farming becomes something as it is today for just a few people with big farms that are sort of mass producing food. And ordinary people, instead, they are the workers in factories. And that's going to change a lot of people's lives. So I'll lay out the pros and cons here. The good news about the Industrial Revolution is, well, it gives us all the stuff that we value, like electricity and stuff like that. And I think on a larger level, it kind of changes the game when it comes to human labor. Back in ancient history, basically, like I say, every time period up until now, the way that labor has worked is it has been human labor. You want something done, you get a whole bunch of people to do it. Maybe use animals sometimes, but mostly it's humans made to do it. And that leads to a lot of things like slavery, like serfs who have to work the farms, various forms of servitude. Up until now, there's a lot of work that has to be done to keep a house in good shape, and that's usually done by the women of that house. And that is their entire role in society because it's just so much work. And also all the slavery and all the sort of role of the poor people to do human labor for the rich people. Eventually, the Industrial Revolution is going to change that with technology that can replace the labor that human beings can do. And it is going to lead to economic booms, time periods where people are really growing together, everybody's making money, rich and poor, and people are succeeding. Now, that said, it's not necessarily obvious that this is going to be the end result because when it starts up, like I say, you have those factories. And that is, in fact, when you have some of the most exploitative labor, arguably worse than farming. Farming has a lot of downsides, but at least you know what you're getting into. Here you have the power holders, the owners of the factories, and you have the workers of the factories. And the owners of the factories don't particularly care if somebody loses a hand, somebody loses an eye, somebody gets poisoned over time. And this is a time period before modern labor laws about what you can and can't do to your workers. This is a time when there's no set, amount of time. There's no limit on how much workers are made to work, or no minimum on how much you can pay them. So the Industrial Revolution definitely didn't seem like a good idea at the time. And the people who were going to those factories, in some ways, it was new opportunities to get away from the farms. In other ways, it was really horrific for them. And it basically destroyed the way that people lived their lives, making stuff for themselves, and sometimes selling that stuff. Now it was making stuff for other people and not really getting to have any of the benefits. And the wealth was going to the upper class, to the elite. So as much as our world is more egalitarian because of the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't so in the 1800s. And it arguably isn't completely so today. Other things like the Victorian city, like the city of London, was a pollution death trap because of all the smog. It was just, and there was like sewage in the streets as the cities got bigger and bigger and more intense. And so being in a city wasn't a great way to live. You might die young. And on top of that, you've got things like deforestation, over mining, problems that are going to be problems now, the ecological problems, but people are not aware of them over the time. And like I say, in the cities, there's lowered health, there's a lot of disease. And so we actually see a lot of peasant uprisings and worker strikes during this time period, people who are protesting against these conditions. But it takes a lot of work on their part to lead to the world we have now, where we have things like labor laws at all. And arguably those are weaker than they used to be, but at least there's something, and it was in large part due over the next 100 years here, from the 1800s into the 1900s, probably even further actually. We see protesters and strikes and people trying to fight back against the power of the factory owners. It's thanks to them that we have more of a fair system. But you can really see how people got the idea that the factory was a monster that was kind of devouring people. And this is still a subject of discussion much later on. This is from a film called Metropolis from the 1930s, but they're still talking about this idea of the workers versus the factory, and the factory being a place that eats people, devours them alive, costs them of their lives, like some sort of monster. And I think that's really important to keep in mind during this time period. In a lot of ways, things are not going great for people who are working in the factories. Women, interestingly, are mostly working in the clothing factories now, because clothing is thought of as women associated. But this is a lot of young girls, sign up to make money, maybe to get away from the farms to improve their lives in some way. But it's a very risky thing for them. So both men and women are being affected by this. On top of that, this is also a time period where Europe is being very colonial. We talked about this a little bit before, but in the 1800s, and especially the late 1800s, it goes to a whole nother level. All these different parts of the world are taken over by various European countries. And one of the big things that happens is Africa. Previously, Africa was kind of independent from all of this, from Europeans taking over. Instead, Europeans were taking over in places like India and Australia. But now we have Africa. We have what's known as the scramble for Africa, or to put a really, dark, intense spin on it, which is fitting, I think, the rape of Africa. Africa is being abused and mistreated. Those are both terms that are being used there. And the powerful European countries, who are getting more and more powerful due to their technology, are thinking about Africa and how do we exploit Africa to our benefit, is the idea that they have. And they screw a lot of things up, basically. As the book says, they cause a lot of long-term damage to these countries, A, by sort of weakening the institutions that are already there, and B, by placing them in a position of dependency on the Europeans. Now, this is not how the Europeans thought of what they were doing. I mean, some of them definitely did. Some of them were cynical as heck. But others thought of themselves as bringing something noble to other parts of the world. If we remember that the world of Europe and the Christian world in Europe had a sort of superiority complex already, seeing it as the place that had the one true religion. We have the true religion, and everybody else does not. That was a big part of the thinking. And then that leads into a philosophy that can be summed up by the poem The White Man's Burden. So this is a poem by Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling has a lot of other merits, but in this poem, he kind of comes off looking pretty bad these days because he basically lays out the argument that people have at this time, which is that because Europe, Europe and America, what we call the West, has better technology and they argue better culture, that means that Europe has a right to take over these other countries, other regions of the world for their own benefit. Now, as we've just discussed, that wasn't really the whole story. Even if you grant that there was something in giving the technology to these other parts of the world, which, was it really being distributed fairly? Was that really the primary goal there? But even if you say, okay, there was some improvement, some benefit to that, there were better ways to do it, and that wasn't really what a lot of Europeans were trying to achieve. What were they trying to achieve? They were trying to get resources and they were trying to get labor. And this was specifically to benefit countries like Europe, not Europe, Europe is the continent, like Britain and France. So Britain, France, Belgium, oh my God, Belgium did a lot, surprisingly for a country that's kind of small and obscure today. The goal was to get stuff. Like, for instance, the Queen's crown jewels were taken from mines in India, during this time period, and other stuff like that. And like I say, labor is still pretty human labor, even though we're starting off the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, it's arguably worse. So the Europeans end up leaving a lot of problems. And this is why we refer to colonialism, setting up colonies in other countries where Europeans are in charge, or imperialism being kind of an empire trying to control everything, like the British Empire. This is why we see it as a bad thing generally these days. And what usually the pattern is that the Europeans sort of set themselves up at the very top, and then they find locals who are willing to be their subordinates. So the subordinates' lives, maybe they're improving, arguably, but most people's lives, they're not. And then later on, the Europeans leave, and the people who were put in positions of power want to hold on to that power, and the people who did not have power and were being exploited by their other sort of fellow countrymen are frustrated and angry. And that leads to, as well, to a lot of the sort of screwed up politics that you sometimes see in countries that were formerly colonized by Europe. So, not good, not good. America basically has its own equivalent of this, which you've probably heard about, at least in terms of the exploitation of Native Americans, basically trying to push them further and further away as America conquers further and further west, and breaking promises and breaking treaties all along the way. This is all based on the American idea of manifest destiny. So manifest destiny, what does that mean? It's the idea that it was sort of the American destiny to conquer from one edge of the continent to the other. That's the America is going to grow. It's going to be a beautiful country. And for the white Americans, it's a very promising idea of, our country is going to get better and better and bigger, and we're all going to be happier and happier. And arguably, things improved gradually over time for white Americans. But Black people were still being exploited, and Native Americans were pushed into reservations. So none of the white countries come off looking pretty good. And I say that not to dunk on white people necessarily, just to explain that it's important to consider this in the context of history, that this is sort of the history of race relations in the world. This is the history of politics between different countries. And if we forget that, then we're not really able to appreciate why people have the frustrations and issues that they do. So that's all very important to bear in mind. So this is the kind of stuff that the realists are going to be reacting to. They're going to be seeing these problems in the world and arguing that we should do something about it. And they're going to try different approaches to basically show people what's going on so that they actually start waking up and paying attention. It's interesting that some countries like China and Persia aren't directly taken over by the European powers, but they are pushed around by them quite a bit. One of the big events that takes place during this time is the Opium Wars in China. So opium, it's a very addictive substance, very addictive drug, and made from the poppy seed. And the British had set up trade deals with China where they were basically selling them opium. And eventually, this became a real endemic problem in China. A lot of people were high on opium. And so China, much like a country trying to, declare war on drugs today, basically said that, no, this is bad. This is bad for people. We're going to try and cut down on it. So British, you can't sell as much opium here. And the British, they flipped their lid and they started a war with China. And they won that war. And China was forced to, accept the opium deals as they were. So it's pretty wild. And the thing that is the most galling is that the British stereotype of Chinese people during this time period was, they're all high on opium all the time. Like, come on. But again, this was a part where European biases, and ideas of stereotyping other regions really played an effect. They had this idea that Chinese people were decadent, they were Oriental, they were obsessed with luxury, not like Europeans who were good, solid, salt of the earth folks. So, this type of thinking plays into everything. Another thing that happened during this time was the opening of Japan. Japan initially refused to do any trade with European countries, but then a bunch of British people and American people showed up with ships and guns and made them. So that had an effect on how Japan was thinking of things as well. So there's a lot to think about here. Okay, so we've got all these problems in the world. I want to point, while we're still on this video, to a few different people who are interested in solutions to these problems. One of them, and this is a name you have probably heard, for better or for worse, one of them was Karl Marx. And we should give some credit to his buddy, Friedrich Engels, because they wrote the Communist Manifesto together. But who were these guys? Marx is a specter haunting, modern political thought. People are afraid of Marx or they embrace Marx. But what's really the deal here? Well, Marx and Engels were philosophers, so they were trying to think about things. A lot like Hegel in trying to think about, what is the nature of society? How does history happen? How do things change over time? And they had some real ideas. They saw these problems, and their response to it was develop a theory of social classes, which, are a real thing. There's the rich, there's the poor, there's various places you can be in between. And in the Communist Manifesto, these two laid it out like this. History is a struggle between social classes, between those who have resources, aka, the rich or more upper class people, and the have-nots, the lower class people. And they identified two groups. One was the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie, this is a French word, originally means something more like middle class, but for Marx it was sort of upper class. And it means those who control the factories and the means of production, those who have the money and the power, basically. We were just talking about them, right? We were talking about the factory owners versus the factory workers. And the factory workers, Marx and Engels referred to as the proletariat. The proletariat are the workers. And Marx pointed out that the structure of things is inherently unfair in all these factories. The owners, they get a lot of money and a lot of benefit from the factories, whereas the workers, they get minimal benefit. And in fact, they make things that they don't get to keep. The workers, the factory owner doesn't make anything. He is sort of parasitically, at least according to Marx, controlling, the resources here. Whereas the proletariat is the worker who's actually doing all the work. If you're making shoes, who's making the shoes? It's the worker. And then the factory owner comes in and he cleans up. That's not fair. So Marx advocated and Engels advocated that the workers should realize this and seize the means of production. They should seize the machines, the resources, everything that the factory's owners had that allowed them to stay on top. And they should change society. This should be kind of like a future revolution, kind of like the Revolutionary War in America or the French Revolution. And in this revolution, the workers should evenly distribute the resources and create a society without these classes. And also, interestingly, without property. People don't get to hold on to stuff because everybody shares it equally. And so you don't have one person oppressing the others. That's the idea that Marx and Engels put forth out there. And this idea is known as communism, but the book also describes Marx and Engels as socialist. Socialism would be sort of a weaker version of this idea. I think the thing that people usually distinguish communism from socialism is the idea of there should be a revolution. There should be a violent revolution that overthrows the existing power structure. Marx and Engels were kind of down on that team, whereas I think today, I think most people wouldn't go that far. They would say maybe, we want this society, but not through this kind of revolution. And part of the reason for that is because when people did actually try to have that revolution later on, it went pretty badly. And this is something we're going to discuss more when we get to the sort of World War I, World War II era, and talk about the power structures there. But for now, I think what I want to point out is that it wasn't really as Marx and Engels had intended it. It didn't end up being a system where there were no power structures as they had hoped. It ended up being a system where there was a power structure that didn't want to acknowledge it was a power structure. Everybody's equal, but in fact, you may have read Animal Farm. Some of the animals are more equal than others. Some of them have more power, but they hide the power. So I don't think that's what Marx and Engels would have anticipated. And so we should bear in mind that it's, the socialist idea of this is different from the hard communist idea of this that eventually ended up being implemented. And I feel like even these original philosophers would not have gone with Stalin and the USSR. But there's other interesting aspect to these guys, and that's that they're philosophers in general. They're not just focused on this one issue or of economic inequality. They are also very interested in thinking differently about history. We're going to talk about that again in a second. But that their analysis of history tends to be very different from the idea of there were great men and they did great things, which had dominated historical thinking up until this point. Instead, Marx and Engels emphasize wealth and resources and logistics. So this is why they're so interested in the resources of different social classes, is because that's the kind of stuff that they think about. In a study of a war, instead of looking at, who was the general in charge, they would look at, well, how much food did the different sides have? How many weapons did they have? Why was this? Did they have better iron mines or something like that? And this is a school of thought that is still pretty relevant today in terms of the way we think about history. So if you hear a Marxist historian or even a Marxist philosopher, don't assume it necessarily means a communist philosopher. It might just mean one who is concerned with the way resources and logistics work. Okay, but like I said, there is a sort of weaker version of Marx's ideas, or not weaker as in it's bad, just weaker as in it's less extreme. And that might be summed up well by the ideas of John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill didn't argue for a violent revolution, but he did argue that there should be an answer to the inequality of the social classes, that the factories should be in the hands of the people who are working in them. They should get a say. And eventually this is going to lead to concepts like labor unions and whatnot, people who are gathering together to be able to fight being exploited. And so, John Stuart Mill says, the association of the laborers themselves on terms of equality, owning the capital, that is the money and resources with which they carry on their operations, and working under managers elected and removable by themselves. That's his idea. We might call that a more socialist idea. I don't know if he would use that word, but here's a philosopher who's saying, who doesn't go all the way that Marx does, but is seeing these inequalities and says that we should do something about them. So this is kind of the background to the realist artists we're going to talk about in a little bit. John Stuart Mill has a lot of philosophy, actually, which we aren't going to get into in super in depth, but he talks a lot about freedom. He says the only reason you should restrict somebody is to prevent harm to others. And he talks a lot about women's rights. He believes that the subordination of women to men is wrong itself. And he says, the chief hindrances to human improvement and ought to be replaced by equality. So he's advocating against the norms that women are subordinate to men, which is great. You don't see a lot of guys in history doing that. So this is a new era where people are thinking about all these things quite a lot bit more. In part, this has a lot to do with the rise of a lot of women leaders advocating for women's political rights, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They are eventually going to be the kind of people who lead the charge for women to have the right to vote and say that, hey, women should be allowed and are a part of the society, should be allowed to make decisions for the society. Why should they be not represented? There's no taxation without representation. Well, why should women be taxed without representation? So they're important advocates. There's a major event, the Seneca Falls Conference, where a lot of women and men work together to draft, and this is, Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are involved in stuff like this, draft a kind of new declaration of human rights, and it says all men and women are created equal. That's echoing Thomas Jefferson, but with a new frame of thought. This is also a time period where we see education for women start to take off. We see a whole lot of new institutions that are dedicated to educating women, women's colleges. Eventually, these are going to be, a lot of them are going to be colleges for both women and men. But for now, there's a segregation between the two of them. So this has been an issue for all of human history, basically, that women have been exploited in various ways and that women have been subordinated to men and not been able to have power for themselves or independence of men. They had to abide by what men were doing, the men they were married to, the men they were related to. But for the first time, people are starting to really issue challenges to that and really think philosophically about, how can we change this? How can we make that better? So in part that has to do with Enlightenment optimism, but it also involves this sort of realist look at what are these real problems that we see. And finally, I just want to mention the rise of what's sometimes been called historicism, which is basically just a modern way of thinking about history. Like what we're doing right here with our history study, trying to think about what are the different types of causes for things and who are the people, but also what are the resources, what are the ideas that are important. That's modern history, and that wasn't the way history used to be done. Like I said, history used to be done in a framework where it was sort of like pretty exclusively focused on the idea of leadership and being a good or a bad person. Like you would look at different leaders like Julius Caesar or Napoleon, and you would say, okay, well, did they do a good job? Did they do a bad job? Which ones of all these historical people are the great leaders and who are the bad leaders? That was kind of the framing. That's what we call great man history. Who are the great men of history? And it tends to assign maybe more importance than we would today to the individual choices of these great men, maybe in part because it makes a good story, rather than all the different factors that are involved in everything. I think today we kind of have a mix. We have a little bit of thinking about, individual people in history and what their choices were able to achieve, but we're also very aware that they are part of a larger context of all these decisions, all these ideas that we've been talking about, right? It wasn't just like Karl Marx, it was a lot of other people who were influential on Karl Marx, like Hegel, and, influential on John Stuart Mill. Everything is interconnected. So we talk more about the society, more about the world than just the individuals. And also on top of that, modern historicism is very much more evidence-based than it used to be, because the goal is not this moral judgment. The goal is figuring out, wait a minute, what actually happened? How can we figure that out? So historicism uses things like archaeology. It uses things like looking more closely at the way things are written, like the texts to say, oh, actually this was written by two different authors. Uses things like carbon dating to determine when different artifacts were created, or in science to determine when different fossils come from. And there's more of an attitude of you have to prove things. You can't just take them as an assumption. And so this actually leads to a lot of shocks to a lot of people's systems. For one thing, like I said, with textual studies, where they analyze texts and realize that they're written by different authors, that was pretty shocking to a lot of people's understanding of the Bible. You know, we can see, for instance, in the book of Genesis, that there's multiple different authors going on there just because they use different names for God and use slightly different sets of vocabulary. And people are pretty clear on that now. But the sort of fundamentalist interpretation is, you know, it's all created by God and every bit of it is divinely perfect. Well, if it's, you know, more based on individual people, doesn't that challenge that a little bit? And that was something that unsettled people, in the same way that Darwin's theory of evolution unsettled people's idea of how life had come to be. Archaeology challenged a lot of what people thought about the world. And yeah, in general, people had to accept things like the world was older than they thought it was. And a lot of assumptions just got overturned. And, you know, I think that has something to do with the Enlightenment. It also has something to do with being able to rethink one's beliefs. All right, so that's historicism. So this is all the stuff that's floating around in the consciousness of the realists during the 1800s. So in the next video, I want to look at what kind of art did the realists create? Literature, you know, visual arts, all sorts of other stuff. So I will see you guys in that video.